History as it happens, November 14th, 2023. How wars are lost.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations.
The designated head of the German state signed the act of unconditional surrender.
General puts his signature to the document which acknowledges the complete defeat of the German armed forces by those of Britain, Russia.
General Douglas MacArthur has been appointed the Supreme Allied Commander to receive the Japanese surrender.
Vladimir Putin has just addressed the Russian people moments ago, announcing what Putin called the start of a military special operation.
We are not ready to give our freedom to this terrorist Putin.
It's exactly a month since Hamas killed 1,400 people in coordinated attacks on southern Israel planned in Gaza.
Gaza's hospitals are at the center of the fight, and amid the mounting civilian...
In this moment of tragedy, I want to say to them and to the world and to terrorists everywhere that the United States stands with Israel.
Warfare has evolved since 1945, but effective strategic leadership is just as important today as it was when the Allies conquered Germany and Japan. Whether wars are fought in jungles, deserts, packed city streets, or cyberspace. Putin failed the leadership test in Ukraine. Israel is trying to destroy Hamas in Gaza. How should we define success? Where do modern leaders keep getting it wrong? That's next with Andrew Roberts as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
He invaded with something like 160,000 troops in February 2022, and since then it's sucked up many more, and in fact he's running at about 160,000 casualties. It is an example of how little war has changed, but then of course technologically, with some of the things that have been going on, specifically of course with drones, it's actually been an interesting hint and signpost to future warfare as well.
In 1945, the Allies defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, ending the worst war ever fought and vaulting the U.S. to a position of unrivaled global economic and military power.
General Eisenhower's battle headquarters in the ancient city of Reims was the businesslike setting for Germany's unconditional surrender. And just before the delegates arrived, a few out of the millions...
This afternoon, a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no...
The way the war ended, in total victory, the unconditional surrender of two enemies who had committed crimes against humanity, the word genocide was coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1944, continues to loom large in American memory. It was the good war and we were the good guys. And at the time led very briefly to the idea that the world would embark on an era of peace. Well, as historian Andrew Roberts writes in his new book, co-authored with General David Petraeus, future wars, starting with Korea in 1950, would show that wars end more messily in the modern world, that there may be several substitutes for victory if it turns out that outright victory is beyond reach. That's on page 35 of Conflict, the evolution of warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. You might also say the unconventional has become the norm in warfare, with powerful countries such as the U.S. fighting long, draining, and ultimately unwinnable wars against guerrilla forces in small countries that are not vital national security concerns, where the winning of hearts and minds proved impossible in showers of Agent Orange and napalm. The Soviets had their own quagmire in Afghanistan. Well, Andrew Roberts will be here in a moment to discuss his new book and apply its ideas to the ongoing wars in Ukraine and Gaza. So, the evolution of warfare. In some ways, war hasn't changed since 1945. Civilians continue to pay an appalling price for the misdeeds of their governments. It was in the Second World War where tens of millions of civilians were simply murdered or starved for being the wrong race or wearing the wrong uniform. Today, we talk of ethnic cleansings or collateral damage. Maybe there's never been a stark dividing line separating armies from civilians. As mentioned, ordinary people have always suffered in wars. But in the Second World War, the ideas of Italian air strategist Giulio Douhet were adopted by the combatants, and the world witnessed the deliberate bombing of civilians as legitimate military targets. The doctrine of strategic air power was meant to terrorize the population into surrender while destroying the enemy's capacity to make war. A person working in a factory manufacturing artillery shells is just as legit a target as the artillery gunner on the front line, so the argument goes. Every major combatant in the Second World War bombed civilians, but only the U.S. and U.K. fully embraced the doctrine of strategic bombing, or saturation bombing of urban areas, and had the resources to pull it off. In an episode from August titled Oppenheimer, Dropping the Bomb, I spoke to historian David M. Kennedy about this development in warfare.
And the concept of strategic bombing was first articulated in a book by an Italian war theorist named Giulio Douhet. Despite the French sound of his name, he was Italian. And it's early 1920s. It's called The Command of the Air. And strategists in all major countries thinking about their grand strategy in the event of another conflict read that book carefully. Only two societies or countries, nations, fully adopted Giulio Douhet's ideas about how to wage war. And those two countries were, as it happens, the United Kingdom and the United States. And you're absolutely right. When the war broke out in 1939 and there were German bombings of Polish cities and later London and British cities, Franklin Roosevelt loudly condemned, publicly condemned the bombing of civilian targets as contrary to the rules of the accepted rules of warfare and immoral in all of its aspects. Nonetheless, the United States made a decision in the early 1930s, before the war, long before the war had begun, that in the event of a future conflict, the United States would commit to building a major strategic air arm. Now, strategic air power is a particular form of air power. Its logic is to attack the enemy homeland, cripple his industries, and terrorize his populations. Douhet was explicit about this. This was one of the objectives of strategic air warfare. It's true the Germans bombed civilian cities, so did the Japanese, so did the Russians for that matter. But the only two powers that really decided to make the strategic air arm one of the principal arms that they mobilized were the British and the Americans. Early on in the conflict, the British were trying to bomb inside Germany, but the losses to their air arm were so great, they decided they could no longer bomb specifically accurately on military targets. They had to bomb at night at what was called saturation bombing. They would simply dump their loads over big urban areas and come what may, because they couldn't tolerate the losses they suffered in daylight bombing. The Americans in the European theater tried to avoid that as much as they could and tried to hew to the doctrine of bombing only military targets inside Germany in the daylight with precision, accuracy, and so on. But even in the European theater, by February of 1945, Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, authorized attacks on civilian targets simply for their psychological impact. So there was an attack on Berlin in February of 1945 that had no particular constraints on where the bombs were dropped. It was to try to shock the Germans in this late stage of the war into finally throwing in the towel. About 25,000 civilians were killed in one night in Berlin in February of 1945. In the Pacific theater, by that time, as you put it so well, the moral Rubicon had already been crossed. By the time the Allies in this case meant the United States just about exclusively, they had the long-distance bomber, the B-29, based in the Mariana Islands, and it was possible to bomb Japanese cities and the Japanese homeland regularly and routinely. And they started doing that in late 1944, all through the first part of 1945, night after night after night. These enormous bomber fleets would take off from American bases and firebomb Japanese cities.
In many wars, large and small, fought since 1945, warring nations have bombed civilians and civilian infrastructure. We're seeing this in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the indiscriminate shelling of cities and missile strikes on civilian areas. Russia utterly destroyed Grozny in the First Chechen War, too, and during Syria's civil war, Russia bombed urban areas. Israel has killed more than 10,000 Palestinians in the bombing of Gaza, although, and this is where moral questions become hotly contested, Israel says the purpose of the war is not to kill ordinary people, but to destroy Hamas. And Hamas uses the Al-Shifa hospital as a military base, for instance. On NBC's Meet the Press, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made this argument about intent, pointing to the fact that Hamas deliberately butchered civilians on October 7th.
The main difference is, are you deliberately targeting civilians? No, we're deliberately doing everything in our power to target the terrorists, and the civilians, as happens in every legitimate war, are sometimes what are called collateral damage. That's a laundered way of saying unintended casualties. That's clearly what Israel is doing. And what clearly Hamas is doing is the opposite. They're doing everything in their power to have their civilians hurt because they want this ridiculous and wanton attack on Israel, on Israel's legitimacy to take root. And unfortunately, people are giving into this.
In their book, Andrew Roberts and General Petraeus are less interested in the reasons why particular wars were started, the politics behind the wars, than how those wars were prosecuted, how they were won or lost. And they look at the post-1945 idea that modern counterinsurgency campaigns must win hearts and minds. The French in Algeria, the Americans in Vietnam are cited as two examples where the colonizing or invading power utterly failed in this regard. Well, is Israel trying to win hearts and minds? As French President Emmanuel Macron put it, it's impossible to fight terrorism by killing civilians. If Hamas can't be destroyed, then what? If Russia can't defeat Ukraine, then what? As for Hamas, its leaders have made it plain they attacked Israel to provoke massive retaliation, to create a permanent state of war. Hamas's intent is to destroy the Jewish state. Setting an attainable strategic goal is step one in avoiding disaster, if you believe there are military solutions to our modern problems. Lord Andrew Roberts, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin. It's great to be back on.
It's an honor to have you, and I can say with confidence, even though I can't name all of my guests off the top of my head, since I've done something like 280 episodes, I do know that you are the first member of the British House of Lords to be on the show.
An added honor.
How's that going for you?
Oh, it's fascinating. I love it. You get experts, true experts in their fields talking about things that they know a lot about because they spent a lifetime doing it. And so as a result, you have really interesting debates, really interesting. It's a bit like going back to Cambridge University, frankly, kind of endless seminar.
Well, I feel like I'm back in college, too, doing this show twice per week. I've got a stack of books behind me here. Well, anyway, about your latest book, co-written with General David Petraeus, Conflict, the Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. You say one reason for writing the book was to place Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine in context. That context is how warfare has evolved since 1945. Putin's war has, unintentionally has it not, demonstrated how little has changed in warfare. Insofar, it still takes massive numbers of infantry to wage a campaign of this kind, right?
It certainly does, yes. He invaded with something like 160,000 troops in February 2022. And since then, it's sucked up many, many more. And in fact, he's running at about 160,000 casualties. So it is an example of how little war has changed. But then, of course, technologically, with some of the things that have been going on, specifically, of course, with drones, it's actually been an interesting hint and signpost to future warfare as well. So you're right, Ukraine does have both of those aspects, really.
But I think really your point was to say you can't wage World War II style invasions like this anymore. They just don't work. It was folly to start the war in this manner. Well, really, it was folly to start the war at all, no matter how he would have prosecuted it, right?
Yes, the defensive capabilities tend to outweigh the offensive even more heavily than they did in 1939 to 1945. The anti-tank weaponry, for example, is far more advanced than it was during the Second World War. And of course, you needed to have complete air domination, and the Russians did not have that. The Ukrainians have managed to deny that. In some areas, of course, though, one thinks of the Donbass, there are features of that war, trenches, for example, barbed wire and so on, which are actually quite reminiscent of the First World War rather than the Second. But equally, in very advanced, technologically advanced war, this is the first sort of iPhone war, of course, as well.
Yeah, it's a bizarre mix of drones and high tech, modern anti-tank weaponry, as you mentioned, but also we have trenches and minefields. Margaret Macmillan wrote a great essay about this in Foreign Affairs a couple of months ago, which she also brings up some other issues that you touch upon as well. Just the mountain of miscalculations. I mean, this was an unprovoked war. Russia did not have a casus belli. The Ukrainians have morale and what you might call home field advantage on their side. The war is a stalemate now. But, on page 4 of your book, the central argument you're making here, there are 4 major tasks political or military leaders must master in order to get war right. Talk about those 4 major tasks and apply them to what happened here with Russia.
Well, the first one, of course, is for the strategic leader. It all really comes down to strategic leadership, victory in warfare. You can start off owning all the cities, having a much larger army, having better equipment and more of it and so on. But if you haven't got the strategic leadership right, you're not going to win. And you see this again and again. We have not written a comprehensive history of all of the 140 wars there have been since 1945, but we have chosen a couple of dozen of the key climacteric ones, the ones that really have a paradigm shift. You see again and again the strategic leadership is vital. And you mention rightly the 4 tasks of the strategic leader. And the first one, of course, is to get the big idea right, the overarching concept of what the war is about. Then after that, you've got to communicate it to the not just your immediate lieutenants, but to the whole of your organization throughout the length and breadth. Then after that, you have to see the idea that you've communicated, driven through, forced through onto the battlefield and beyond. And then you have to ensure that it's constantly updated. And so it's sort of changing and being defined and redefined again and again and again.
So where is Russia going wrong then on the big strategic idea? I mean, I guess I'm no military analyst here. Ukraine is a large country, and the people there, they are resisting Russian domination. Putin got this entirely wrong. He thought they'd be welcomed.
That's right, yes. The first thing that Putin got wrong was indeed the big idea of invading Russia in the first place. He did indeed believe that his own propaganda, essentially, that the Ukrainian government was neo-Nazi, despite the fact that it was run by Zelensky, who's Jewish. He believed that he'd be able to take over a country of 44 million people in the matter of 1 or 2 weeks, which, considering the size of Ukraine, was ludicrous, essentially. And he also failed to communicate his plans successfully. You see him at the end of that long white table where 30 feet away his minions are sort of taking orders. Now, work that against President Zelensky, whose big idea was, I need ammunition, not a ride. I'm going to stay in Kyiv. My family are going to stay in Kyiv. No Ukrainians of military age are going to leave Ukraine. We're going to fight this to the end. That is a big idea. It's the right one. And it's also one that he was able to communicate brilliantly to the whole country. His army, of course, but also the whole of the rest of the country. And ultimately also in the speeches that he made via Zoom to all the parliaments. He was able to project that to the whole world. And he's done all of the 4 jobs of the strategic leader extremely well. And Putin has done them extremely badly. And as a result, even though Russia is 3 times the size of Ukraine, at the moment, it only controls 17 to 18% of Ukraine's landmass.
Hard to say how the war is going to end, and my next question is going to address that. But to this point, it's an intractable, massive strategic defeat for Russia. Putin should have listened to Bruce Lee. The best decision is not to fight, the great martial arts hero. Probably weren't expecting me to quote him here. So
you're not quoting from the book, I'm pleased to say.
No, Bruce Lee's not in the book. So when it comes to the current state of the war in Ukraine right now, you say here the Korean War showed that one of the most important ways warfare had evolved since 1945 was that one is rarely rewarded with the satisfaction of the suicide of the enemy dictator in the bunker in Berlin or a formal surrender signature ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Harbor. Wars end more messily in the modern world, and there are several acceptable substitutes for victory if it turns out that outright victory is beyond reach, usually due to domestic political considerations rather than anything that has taken place on the battlefield. So
yes, that's right, and you are seeing that to an extent actually in Ukraine at the moment. I don't mean domestic political aspect in Ukraine itself. David Petraeus and I visited Kyiv. He's had a couple of visits recently. We were last there about 4 or 5 months ago, and the morale there. You mentioned morale earlier, and morale in this book is a tremendously important aspect of victory or defeat in the war. The morale in Ukraine is tremendously high, very surprisingly high, considering actually what they've been through over the last 18 months. So that does fit into the overall concept. But the point you were trying to make, I think, was that it doesn't necessarily end with a peace treaty signed in Moscow that Putin puts his name to, saying he's never going to invade Ukraine again. No, of course it doesn't. And it could well wind up like the Korean War, where you have no peace treaty at all. You have a demilitarized zone, which is internationally appreciated, but not actually written in a peace treaty.
Problem here is that in wars of attrition, it looks like nothing is happening until one side cracks. And it's really hard to know when one side or the other might crack. Will it be political? Will it be military? But here in the United States, if anyone suggests that maybe Ukraine won't be able to expel all of Russian forces from Ukraine proper, including Crimea, I mean, that is Zelensky's maximalist stance right now. He wants to liberate Crimea as well. If you suggest that's not possible, you're called a stooge for the Kremlin. I mean, neither side really wants to. I mean, that's the problem. That's why these wars go on and on and on and on. No one wants to negotiate when, well, so much blood and so much treasure has been expended. And, your side, in the Ukrainians' case, has a large chunk of its country still being occupied, about 20%.
You never get peace when at least one side thinks it can still win. I mean, that's
what I was trying to say, not so articulately, but go ahead.
And at the moment, both Ukrainians and Russians think they can still win this war. So, yes, there's no prospect for peace anytime soon. I certainly don't think that I'm a stooge for Putin, but it comes down to the United States, essentially, whether or not the Ukrainians are still going to have the weaponry necessary to fight this war indefinitely. The G7 actually did say the support will be given indefinitely, but it's the US that's given as much as the whole of the rest of the world put together to Ukraine. It's also given ATACMS and other missile systems that are essential to a Ukrainian victory. So whether you get a Ukrainian stalemate or a Ukrainian victory is largely down to America. Now, that doesn't mean that America can force a peace onto Ukraine that Ukraine doesn't want. It can't, and Ukrainians are quite clear about that. But if a future, say, incoming president were to cut off aid to Ukraine, this war would go on and on and on.
Well, the right thing to happen would be for Putin to resign and a new Russian leadership to withdraw all the forces from Ukraine. But we know that's not going to happen. So it's an impossible question to answer. Will it be worth it if it takes 5, 6, 7 years for Ukraine to ultimately prevail? Will it be worth it, the cost in lives lost and destruction to the country?
Yes, you've got to get to a position where the continued occupation of 20%, as you say, of Ukraine is unsustainable for Putin. That's the point at which you get a kind of Ukrainian victory, or at least not a Ukrainian defeat. And in the end, it's not your liberty and independence or mine that's being fought over here. There are no British or American soldiers fighting. They're just Ukrainians who are being helped by us. So it's not really for us to try to impose some kind of a settlement. It's definitely their decision.
I'm always uncomfortable when I weigh in on this because it's not my country that's been invaded. So one of your fascinating observations here as you get into how warfare has changed, you talk about technology, you talk about tactics, but you're really getting at something bigger. The kinds of wars that are being fought now are different. But your point is that what you might call unconventional wars were conventional for most of the human experience. The World War II total victory 1945 kind of war was an anomaly.
Yes, there haven't been states since the treaty, before the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, or at least not that many established ones. You've got Britain and France, but few others. And not even Britain, really. It was England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland in those days. So yes, in that sense, you don't have state-on-state wars, but we have had 250 years of them now. So they are a pretty established part of the human condition, and that's certainly what, obviously, Russia-Ukraine is. But it's not what most of the wars, most of the 140 wars since 1945 have been. They've been insurgency and counterinsurgency, guerrilla campaigns, the kind of fighting also that's taking place in the Middle East at the moment as well. And they've been characterized by horrific atrocities. I think the sheer level of butchery and the sort of bestial nature of the butchery on the 7th of October does stand out. That's almost medieval in its sadism and so on. But David Petraeus and I went to visit Bucha outside Kyiv, where some 450 innocent Ukrainian civilians were massacred and executed, and some of them showed signs of torture. It hasn't got any less disgusting, really, war since 1945, or indeed, as we've seen, since the Middle Ages.
I recently had David M. Kennedy on the show to discuss Oppenheimer and the decisions to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But really, the moral Rubicon had been crossed much earlier in the war with the saturation bombing or terror bombing of European and Japanese cities, German and Japanese cities. The Nazis never really developed a strategic air arm, so they weren't able to unleash that kind of horror on their enemies for the most part. But my point is...
Sorry, hang on, just to catch you up.
Rotterdam, okay.
I live in London. We had 50,000 people killed in the Blitz of 1940-41. We certainly felt that they had quite an impressive Luftwaffe air arm when it came to bombing.
Yeah, I did not mean to overlook that. I meant a strategic air arm. The United States had wave after wave after wave of B-29s that burned entire cities to the ground in Japan.
Yeah, we were bombed 58 days in a row in wave after wave after wave of German Luftwaffe bombing attacks.
The deliberate targeting of civilians. I'm not sure when we can say that Rubicon was crossed in human history. Civilians have always been victims of wars. Post-1945, it seems to have become accepted. Would you say that's right?
No, I think Guernica was probably the first time that civilians were deliberately attacked, and then, as you mentioned, Rotterdam, obviously, also in Warsaw when Hitler unleashed Blitzkrieg in the east, and then after that, obviously, in the Second World War. So yeah, it was something that built up. The important thing, though, is that it tends to be in the post-1945 war. One can take examples in Vietnam in particular where it's not the case, but it tends to be used, air power tends to be used against military targets, because if you have air domination necessary, you see this in war after war, certainly from Korea onwards. If you are able to take out enemy armor, for example, from the air, and obviously infrastructure, key places, bridges, and so on, then it gives you a massive advantage on the battlefield. And it's very rare that you can see armies winning. Maybe the crossing of the Yalu River in Korea is an exception to this, but armies tend to win if they've got air dominance.
My conversation with David M. Kennedy about strategic air power in the Second World War, only the U.S. and the United Kingdom dedicated such a large amount of their industrial capacity to strategic bombing. Bomber Harris in the United Kingdom, and in the United States it was Curtis LeMay in the Pacific. If you want to.
We couldn't have pulled off D-Day had we not smashed the French railway nodes. You do need, on occasion, to drop bombs essentially on civilians, and that's what happened. And as a result, the western part of the European continent was liberated. It's not a sort of open and shut case morally in any way, in my view.
And I agree. It's a very difficult moral question. The French did, under de Gaulle, give the okay for this. They knew that this was necessary at the time to attack.
They didn't like quite the numbers, in fact. There's some 80,000 French died in that bombing. I don't think de Gaulle quite recognized until it was very much underway. And he did make a severe representations both to FDR and Churchill. And at one point, Dwight Eisenhower actually gave the threat to resign because he didn't want his men to go in when the bombing hadn't taken place. So it was a very difficult Allied decision, that one, but the correct one.
Yeah, many French civilians died even before an Allied soldier landed on June 6th. So Israel today is being criticized heavily globally for its campaign in Gaza. And, in Israel's history of its many wars with its Arab neighbors that you detail, many of these in your book, the longest operation since independence was 3 months, and that was the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. And that didn't involve house-to-house combat, but it was urban warfare. The Israelis laid siege to Beirut. Is there anything from Israel's military history, or even recent U.S. history in Afghanistan or Iraq, that would serve as a guide to this very long campaign that's unfolding now, going to possibly be a long campaign in Gaza?
I think if you look at some of the fighting in Mosul in 2016, you see the US supporting the Iraqi army in destroying ISIS, and they did it in 8 months. It was a bit like this in that it was door-to-door, room-to-room, cellar-to-cellar. You didn't have the tunnel networks that you have in Gaza, of course, but you did have to fight what was called Ratskrieg in Stalingrad. It was literal sort of face-to-face fighting. And of course, that is very high cost. You lose a lot of men doing it. But Israel doesn't have 8 months. It can't take 360,000 reservists out of its economy for 8 months. The United States has already changed its stance in the United Nations. On the 18th of October, it vetoed calls for a so-called humanitarian pause, and now it's in favor of them. So essentially, in the long term, the diplomatic clock is ticking very loudly for Israel. It just doesn't have that amount of time.
And to your point about getting the big strategic ideas right, if Hamas is going to be destroyed here, then what happens? Does Israel want to reoccupy the Gaza Strip, or is there going to be some type of international force? I mean, these are important.
Israel certainly doesn't want to. It might make the threat to, in order to encourage. In fact, Bibi Netanyahu has already talked in very vague terms about an occupation, which he doesn't want to do any more than anybody else. What it really want to do, I think, is to put the pressure on the United Nations, on Saudi Arabia, perhaps, on the Palestinian Authority, on any power that might, either on its own or with others, actually step in and run Gaza in a sort of post-Hamas way. So, for example, you don't have the education system in which 8-year-old children are told that it's all right, in fact, it's a good idea to kill Jews. You don't have actual textbooks, educational textbooks that say this kind of filthy thing, because if you do, you're condemning your people to another generation of this kind of warfare.
I'll share with you some observations briefly here by Thomas Ridd in an article, The Future of Deterrence, Deterrence Beyond the State, the Israeli Experience. Israel's use of military force against non-state enemies does not fit the classic concepts of strategy. We've been talking about strategic concepts here. It's just one act of force to compel one actor to fulfill one specific goal at one given time. Deterrence, on the other hand, consists of a series of acts of force to create and maintain general norms of behavior for many political actors over an extended period of time. Well, the policy of deterrence, with this modus vivendi that it existed with Hamas prior to October 7th, failed. It would seem that there would need to be something new here.
Yeah, no, deterrence doesn't fail with the death cult. They don't conform to general norms of behavior. If you pluck that quote out of what Thomas Ridd says, it's quite clear that an organization that doesn't believe in the Geneva Convention, let alone, sign it in the way that Israel has and most civilized modern states have, the situation, therefore, the dynamic is completely different. You can't deter a state which isn't at all interested, a government, should I say, isn't at all interested in the welfare of its own people, but is interested solely in killing as many Jews as possible. And so, unfortunately, when you can deter, say, China from invading Taiwan, you could deter North Korea from crossing the demilitarized zone. There are any number of acts of deterrence that you can use against rational actors. I mean, Iran has been deterred from going up to the next stage of nuclear enrichment by essentially threats. But what you can't deter is an an organization which is essentially undeterrable because it doesn't care what you do to it.
Yeah, right. In the Hamas charter, it is dedicated to jihad as the only solution to the issue of, who gets to live where on this sliver of land. And I think this is why Netanyahu and successive Israeli governments have been criticized so severely in the Israeli press, because it's not like Hamas is a new organization to them. What happened on October 7th was different in the scope and the ferocity and the barbarity compared to the previous outbreaks of violence between Hamas and Israel since Hamas took over the Gaza Strip. But what are your thoughts on that this was a huge miscalculation on Israel's part?
Well, I think it was an intelligence failure on Israel's part, but it's quite easy to understand how that happened because Hamas really played a blinder on this. It was no longer the old Hamas that used to use essentially Israel's communication system. They used the same communication systems as the Nazis used before the Battle of the Bulge, of just handing orders hand to hand. They had analog telephone lines going down those tunnels. They went back to a system of communication that the Israelis could not hack because it's unhackable. So in a sense, that was a miscalculation by the Israelis about the cleverness, I suppose, of the new Hamas methods. However, there was also a miscalculation of a kind, and this wasn't just the Netanyahu government. This has been successive governments, and actually pretty much the whole of the Middle East thought that Hamas had been contained and that you could get on with making accords with Saudi Arabia and so on, and that there was that soft power worked in the Middle East. There were lots of misunderstandings that were blown away by the events of the 7th of October.
And even if Hamas were to disappear tomorrow, we still have the problem of millions of stateless Palestinians. They're living under military occupation since 1967 on the West Bank. So one more point about the Hamas-Israel war before we wrap up, Andrew Roberts, and that is, I'm not sure Israel is going to solve any problems, even if it destroys Hamas in this current war. I often think of Tacitus. You're much more familiar with the classics than I am, what he said about creating a desolation and calling it a peace.
I think the response needs to have a positive side to it and a positive element to it. It ought to hold out hope for people, not primarily or even solely Israelis, but everybody in the region. You've got to come up with some kind of end state that, or in this case, two states that are going to be more attractive than the same cycle of the last 75 years of violence, of attempts by various different aspects of the Islamic world to destroy Israel, and which is not going to happen. The Israelis are there. They are going to stay there. And so if you're going to have some kind of long-term solution that ordinary people will support, then there is every reason to wipe out Hamas, because Hamas is obviously going to stand out against that come what may. And I think what the Israeli Defense Forces are doing at the moment is the exact right one. Tactically, they're doing this cautiously. They've been slow and careful rather than over hasty. They've already managed to achieve quite a bit. It's just that urban warfare is historically, and we go into this a lot in our book, talking about Fallujah and Rafah and Mosul and so on. It's fiendishly difficult fighting.
10,000 Palestinians have been killed already, and the people there probably not going to listen to explanations, well, this is Hamas's fault or Hamas is using human shields. We have to look at things the way people are going to look at them.
Yes, of course. There's going to be a lot of hatred, but that's war, isn't it? I mean, sometimes you get a chance, such as in 1945 with Germany and Japan, to create a model democracy after a war, but in neither case did you have a religion which calls itself the religion of peace, but which it actually turns out to be anything but.
To my earlier point, 1945 was an anomaly, and I think it still looms large, at least in the American conscious. Wars end much messier, and of course World War II was quite messy to begin with, the worst war ever fought. Wrapping up here, I guess your conclusion is the biggest miscalculation of all was that after 1945 we might see the end of war.
Yes, the first chapter is called The Death of the Dream of Peace. There were people a lot of people in 1945 who thought that, as you so rightly said, the worst war in human history was going to lead to a sort of utopian world in which the concept of war was going to be considered so dreadful by everybody that nobody would do it. Within 1 year, you'd got the Chinese Civil War, in which is a classic example, by the way, of the strategic leadership concept that we started off speaking about at the beginning of this talk. And 6 million people died in it. So the death of the dream of peace, I'm afraid, started almost as soon as the war was over.
You know, any realist when it comes to foreign policy needs to understand that the way political leaders, nation states view their interests are not always rational. They're influenced by notions of nationalism, interpretations of history, jealousies, hatreds, thoughts of greatness and personal legacy. All that applies to Vladimir Putin today.
It certainly does, yes, and not just him either.
That's a really long list.
which is why we need to spend large amounts of money on deterrence and always be at the absolute cutting edge of all military technology.
Andrew Roberts, we thank you for stopping by. The author with General David Petraeus of Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to stay focused on the Middle East and Russia. Sergei Radchenko and Vladislav Zubok will return to discuss Russia's role in the Middle East. From Soviet times to present, what has changed? What hasn't? What is Putin up to there as the Israel and Gaza war rages on? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.